I'm Stephen Moysey. I'm a professor in geological sciences at East Carolina University and the director of the Water Resources Center. I'm going to be reporting today very briefly on some of the data we've been collecting at several sites out in eastern North Carolina, uh, both geoprobe data we've collected as well as some geophysical results. Geoprobe shown here in this image on the left, and some electrical resistivity data being collected on the right. This data was collected with my colleagues Matt Siriani, Elnaz Pajeski, and Alex Manda. So before we jump into talking about the results of that geophysical data, first I want to introduce you to what we're actually going to be measuring, and that's soil electrical conductivity, or soil EC. So what is soil EC? Well, just like when we have a battery that we drive a simple circuit with, such as here with this light bulb, we know that there's some voltage drop that'll be caused by that resistive load of the light bulb. So how easily that current passes through that load depends on how conductive that material it is, or how easily the current can move through. And so we measure that by looking at the ratio of the amount of current we put through to the voltage drop that occurs across that load, and that number is called the electrical conductivity. So why would we care about electrical conductivity? Well, for us, our load is not a light bulb, but the actual soil. And so we're going to be putting electrodes into the ground and actually measuring the amount of current that goes into the ground and the voltage drop that results to get a measure of the electrical conductivity. And as most of us know, different materials will have different electrical conductivities. Materials like gold have a really high electrical conductivity and can easily pass current through them, whereas uh, things like rubber are actually insulators and have a very low electrical conductivity. Well, soils are the same way. Different types of soil materials will tend to have different kinds of conductivities. Clays will tend to have higher conductivities, whereas things like sands will tend to have lower conductivities. If we have wet soil, it will be more conductive, or dry soil, less conductive. And most important for us today is if we have salty water in those soils, or high salinities, we'd expect to have higher conductivities than if those same soils had fresh water in them. We'd have much lower conductivities. And so the conductivity can be really used and helpful to us as a diagnostic tool to understand more about what is happening down within that soil. And rather than just taking one single measurement, like I'm showing here on the right-hand side of the screen, what we actually do in reality is we put in a whole bunch of electrodes into the ground, much like this image, connect them up with wires, and then take many, many measurements of current and voltage, use all those measurements together to create an actual image or cross section of the ground showing us what the electrical conductivity is with depth in the subsurface. Another tool I'm going to show you today is actually more like what I'm showing on the right hand side, where we just have 4 electrodes. And in this case, we're going to put those 4 electrodes on our geoprobe and push that pipe down into the ground. And as we do, we'll be continuously measuring electrical conductivity with those 4 electrodes. And so that'll give us a depth profile of electrical conductivity that we can compare to that imaging data that we got. And so if we do that, we're going to first visit our one of our sites out here in eastern North Carolina we've been working at in Pasquotank County. And I'm going to show you the depth profile data collected along this yellow line, as well as geoprobe data collected at those 2 stars, PCO1 and PCO2. Just real quickly looking at this data, again, you can see that upper image is a cross section, so it's showing us our distance along the profile, or along the ground surface on the top axis, and along the side, or vertically, is showing us going down deeper and deeper into the ground. So again, this is like a snapshot into the ground itself. These low blue colors are showing us low conductivities, whereas what we really see at this site is red right near the surface, where we see some higher conductivity values. And those are pretty concentrated around, well, PCO1, with some little patchiness in some of the other areas along the site. But again, all near the surface, say within about the top meter. If we look at the data we've collected with the geoprobe, again, we see high conductivities near the ground surface, really peaking up quite high right near the surface, and then falling off as we go down with depth. So that's very consistent with what we've seen here over in our resistivity image, or our conductivity image collected using the electrical resistivity method. Um, on the right hand side, where our other geoprobe was pushed down, again, we can see a little bit of an increase right near the surface in conductivity, but then fairly low conductivities comparatively to the left-hand side at PCO1. And so that's really consistent again with what we're seeing in this resistivity data, where we don't see really high conductivities in our image at all. And so far that what we're really seeing is this high concentration of salinity near the surface, but it's not everywhere at this Pasquotank County site. And so we can go and collect data in additional lines. So for example, we could come down here and collect another line running north-south in addition to this east-west line. And so I apologize, but we switched the color axes on you here. So actually the blue in this case is this high conductivity zone we were talking about before, right near the surface, right near PCO1. And again, low conductivities otherwise near the surface, a little bit patchy. And then this bottom image is showing us the profile collected along that north-south line, again, with the north end of it being that orange star where the geoprobe data were located. And again, here we see this high conductivity all near the surface. So it's suggesting, those two results is suggesting we have some kind of zone of high conductivity right in this region, but it's not continuous everywhere. We've collected, and so again, near the surface, if this high conductivity is indeed being caused by differences in salinity, it's kind of focused around the well, whereas the salinity would be concentrated further down in the soil profile in other parts of the site. So to try and understand those patterns data, we collected more data with a slightly different instrument, which is an electrical magnetic induction tool, something we can just walk across the surface with, and we can't get the same depth information, but it'll tell us average electrical conductivity as we move around. And so that's what we've used to create this map on the right hand side. And so again, near PCO1, you can see high conductivities, again shown with blue values, near the well or near the geoprobe site. And as we move from PCO1 to PCO2, you can see a decrease in conductivity as we go. Things are becoming more resistive as we move further away from that PCO1 site. And same thing as we go from north to south, uh, on that secondary line we just looked at. So again, it's showing us we have this zone around PCO1 where we have high conductivities. And of course, if we look across the site overall, then we start to see these patterns emerge where we have connected zones of high conductivity and zones of low conductivity. Our initial interpretations are that many of these zones might be related to things like old paleo channel in this area that you can actually kind of almost see coming up around through in here. And really just the overall dynamics of the site. It could of course be due to things like mineralogy. So at all these sites, we have collected core samples to try and look and see if the soil is changing. We're still working on looking at those cores, and even though we see a little bit of variabilities, for example, at this PCO5 site, we see quite a bit more clay in that than some of the other cores. So far, we don't really see a lot of variability that explains those changes in electrical conductivity that we've seen across the site. But we're still continuing to investigate that some more. As you'll see a little bit later on, what seems to be really important is the actual topography of this site. And so this electrical data seems to correlate fairly well with what we see with topography data collected in this area. And again, related to all of that being connected to this little drainage channel or stream channel over here that connects up to eventually Big Flatty Creek. And again, maybe a source of water coming into this site. But again, it's the overall, all the connectivity of this site seems to be concentrating these salts near the soil surface. If we move over to Camden County and the site we're looking at over there, situation's a little bit different. So this site is right up adjacent to a real marsh site, kind of swampy site. And so in this case, we see a pretty strong, significant pattern as we move across the site. Again, this is this electromagnetic induction data collected on this right-hand side image over here. And just looking at this, the most obvious thing is a trend across the site where we go from the lowest conductivities on the left-hand side, excuse me, the highest conductivities on the right-hand side and the lowest conductivities on the right hand side. So in any case, we're moving from high conductivity to low conductivity as we move from west to east across this site. And so again, as you'll see a little bit later, that seems to be related to some topographic controls on this site, as we have a little bit higher areas over here and lower areas over here. Um, And in addition to those topographic controls, you can also see it does seem like these low conductivity zones in red kind of finger out in the middle between these drainage ditches, and high conductivities tend to move up into the field through those drainage ditches. So in addition to topography, it also seems like these drainage ditches are playing a pretty important role here in terms of controlling some of the salinities at this site. In the electrical resistivity data at the bottom, again, blue is showing high electrical conductivities. We generally see most of those really high electrical conductivities, again, concentrated right near the soil surface with a little bit of variation down towards the bottom in some parts of the field. But really, the highest values are concentrated right near the surface. So again, this seems like a lot of control, potentially by surface water, at the site coming in and influencing what we're seeing in the soils. The final site I'm going to show you is over at this Hyde County, where our study site is on the left-hand side of this image, but that site is really connected hydraulically through ditches and canals all the way back, and natural channels all the way back to the Pamlico Sound. And so that there's a direct pathway connecting this site all the way back to the sound. So it does seem like a site that could potentially be subject to some of these issues of influence of drainage ditches. And so what we see here is, again, some of that influence. So again, blue showing low conductivities, and right along all these ditch areas, uh, or drainage channels, drainage ditches, we see these high electrical conductivity zones. In some areas, that high conductivity is moving into the field, and if there's a few areas where our understanding is these areas actually can become flooded quite often, and that may be part of the reason why we're seeing high conductivities there. So it does seem like ditches play a really important role here in Hyde County. If we look at the electrical conductivity cross-section data, so along these yellow lines, um, so again, ditches appear to be a major control on salinity, but looking at that cross-section image now, so again, this one's collected along these yellow lines, what we can see here is that a lot of salinity is not right near the surface anywhere along that particular area. And so we're really seeing a lot more salinity down at depth. And so that might be starting to suggest that what we're seeing is some influence of groundwater. Again, looking at the profile, or the geoprobe data and the profile from the geoprobe, we can see down around 2 or 3 meters, we get a big spike in electrical conductivity in that geoprobe data. And that again correlates very well with what we're seeing here. So again, this could be salinity. It could be a change in the lithology or the type of soils and rocks that are present in this area. And so that's something we're still looking into a little bit more to make sure we understand exactly what's causing that change in electrical conductivity. But it does seem to be consistent. A little less consistent are these two other geoprobe profiles we're collected on the other side of this line. And here we don't see a good correlation between what we saw with the geoprobe and what we're seeing in this image. We're not entirely clear why that is, but part of the reason might be because these data were actually collected about a year before this image data was collected. And so it's possible we're actually seeing some transient kind of behavior over time where things are really changing through time. And so that's, again, something we're trying to look at and understand better, or if there's a different explanation for what we're seeing with the geoprobe data in this case. But again, it really does seem in this case, not only are these not only are these ditches important in controlling some of those salinity patterns in the field, but it seems like groundwater is probably playing a role here as well. And so we're continuing to look into that, but both of these things appear to be important processes at this site and for this field. So in conclusion, we can really see very different kinds of salinity distributions from Pasquotank County, really concentrated right at the soil surface, versus Hyde County, where we're really seeing that salinity occur further down in the subsurface. And so those are really different indicators of probably different things going on in terms of the processes driving and controlling salinity at these sites. And I think what we're really seeing, especially comparing to other data that's been collected at these sites, is we really need to be thinking carefully about drivers of salinity change being things like topography at the site, even though it's very small changes in topography, what the sources of salt that are available might be, if there are, for example, connections to the sound, the role of ditches in our fields actually being able to transport and move that salt around, and then finally what the geology is like, and if that could be providing a pathway for salt water to be intruding into some of our groundwater areas.